with conditional statements. For your conditional statement, you could write related conditional statements or variations of conditional statements. So one related conditional statement is what's known as the converse. So the converse of a conditional statement is just switching the hypothesis and conclusion of a conditional statement. In general, okay, in words, if we have the conditional statement, if P, then Q, then the converse of that statement is just switching the hypothesis and conclusion. You would take the hypothesis and make it the conclusion. You would take the conclusion and then make it the hypothesis. So the converse of this statement would be if Q, then P. Or in symbols, I could write Q, then implies P. Going back to the first example that we took a look at, if this is your original conditional statement, if you live in Lake Stevens, then you live in Washington. We already identified what the hypothesis is. You live in Lake Stevens, and the conclusion is you live in Washington. So the converse of this statement still would be in if-then form, but if now Q, or the conclusion is you live in Washington, for the converse, that would become the hypothesis. So if you live in Washington, then the original hypothesis of your original conditional statement becomes the conclusion of the converse. So then you live in Lake Stevens. And then you have to think about it. Just because a conditional statement is true doesn't necessarily mean that the converse is true. Or just because, even though we haven't taken a look at an example, a conditional statement is false means the converse is false. So if a conditional statement, or even if a converse is true, it has to be true for every single situation. If you live in Washington, then you live in Lake Stevens. If it's just false for one specific example, that's your counterexample. And if it's false, then you could provide a counterexample. So this would be false. Our original conditional statement, as long as we don't know of any other Lake Stevens in the United States or anywhere else in the world, then we assume that this is true. Okay, if you live in Washington, then you live in Lake Stevens. You could think of quite a few different counterexamples. False. You live in Monroe, Washington. False. You live in Seattle, Washington. Okay, just because you live in Washington doesn't mean that you live in Lake Stevens. So this would be false.